so everyone knows. Told you so. I will throw something at you, bro, honestly. We're trying to film here. What a day. If you've ever leaned into Jesus, but leaned away from Jesus's followers, then this video is for you. Because when I answer the question, why is the church so resistible? And is there anything we can do about it? Now, we actually started this conversation in our previous video, so if you haven't watched that video yet, go back and check it out. But to set up our conversation for this video, let me ask you a question. Have you ever experienced two things that didn't go together? You know, like orange juice and toothpaste, or cereal and water, or Crocs and really everything. Because Jesus' followers combined two things that were never designed together.
In the last video, I told you about a suzerainty tree, which was the idea that if God would look after the nation of Israel and they would obey his commands, he would keep them safe. But Jesus ushers in what's called a promissory covenant, which is an unconditional, unlimited covenant. Regardless of how other people behave, Jesus' death on the cross meant that he would always fulfill his end of the agreement.
Thanks. So effectively, God's promise with the nation of Israel was an I will if you will promise. Oh wow, those are massive lizards. The new that Jesus came to introduce to the world is a little bit more like your primary school crush. Remember in primary school, you're like, I'm gonna love you forever. Except rather than just say it, Jesus did what everyone would do with a promissory covenant in the first century. He offered a sacrifice. Instead of offering the sacrifice as an animal, Jesus offered the sacrifice of himself on a cross. And this new that Jesus ushered in was so much better than the old. The old was between God and a nation. The old was conditional, but the new was between God and everyone. The new was unconditional. And that might sound to you like, hey, it's too good to be true. But Jesus' best friend, John, who was with Jesus, who was there when Jesus died, who looked after Jesus' mother and peered in when the tomb was empty. John said, yeah, there are some conditions for entering into this new covenant. But do you know what they are? He said, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Whoever believes in him will have life. And Peter would say it's actually simpler than that. Because Peter would remember the day that Jesus walked up to him, smiled, and said, follow. This kind of covenant that John and Peter describe is something people want to lean into. It's irresistible. In fact, the only reason that people would be skeptical about it is because it's too good to be true. So what happened? Why has it become resistible? Well, it's become resistible because we've mixed and matched and blended covenants. And nobody understood this better than Paul. See, Paul was a first century Jewish rabbi who became a Jesus follower. So Paul understood better than most people the incompatibility of the old covenant and the new covenant. And Paul, once he became a Jesus follower, started these churches all around the Mediterranean rim. And he started them in a region called Galatia, one specifically. And once he would start these churches, Paul would develop leaders and then would go and plant another. And so Paul had left Galatia, he was planting another church, and a group of Judaizers, Jewish Christians, came along and they spoke to Paul's church at Galatia and they said, hey, you've kind of got part of it, but in order to be a real Christian, first you need to become Jewish. Effectively, what they were doing was blending the covenants. And word got back to Paul about this. And Paul got mad. And so Paul did what everyone who got mad in the first century did. He pulled out his quill and he wrote a letter back to his church at Galatia. This is what he wrote. He said, so Christ has truly set us free. Now make sure that you stay free and don't get tied up again in the law. He's saying, you remember what the old was like? It was complicated, it wasn't freeing. And now that you're free, I want you to stay free. And he goes on and he says this, listen, I, Paul, tell you this, if you're counting on circumcision, which was a mark of the old, to make you right with God, then Christ will be of no benefit to you. He says, hey, if you want to go back to the old way, you got to go back with everything. Because if you mix and match, then Jesus becomes worthless to you. And just to prove his point, he says it again, he says, I'll say it again, if you are trying to find favor with God by being circumcised, you must obey every regulation in the whole law of Moses. For if you are trying to make yourself right with God by keeping the law, you have been cut off from God. You have fallen away from God's grace. And they'd kind of be like, really, Paul? Like, is it really that big of a deal? And Paul would say, hey, imagine this. Imagine I was your friend and I gave you a $100 gift card. And you're like, you know what, that's so generous, but I can't accept that. I'll give you $50. And then you're like, no, I can't accept that. And you're like, hey, maybe I'll give you $25. And you're like, okay, well, I can accept that. Paul would say, well, it's no longer a gift then. And that's what Jesus' death is. It is a gift. It's free to anyone who believes. And the second you keep trying to earn it, you take away from the gift. And then Paul finishes this section of his letter by saying this: but don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. That's the Jesus ethic. Jesus gave up his life for the benefit of others. And when we follow Jesus, when you follow Jesus, you ought to leverage your life and your freedom for the benefit of others. Then Paul wraps up his argument this way. He says, for the whole law can be summed up in one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Are you mixing and matching covenants? Because mixing and matching, it leads to a mess. Mixing and matching leads to a version of Christianity that was resistible. Mixing and matching leads to a version of Christianity that was never intended to be in existence. So let me challenge you. If you are mixing and matching covenants, here's what I challenge you to do: to take your cue from the covenant that God made with you. That covenant, through Jesus, is practically irresistible. That covenant invites people in. That covenant is unconditional. And if as Jesus followers we can get this right, people will hear the message of Jesus and they will want to lean in. Could you imagine what our world would look like if instead of mixing and matching we said the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love? In fact, the first step to irresistible is to stop mixing and matching. Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. If you liked it, subscribe. New videos weekly.